Peace and Justice Support Network of Mennonite Church USA and Mennonite Mission Network. Thank you for joining us tonight. Jesus Weeps, an introduction to the Israel-Palestine conflict. We've got a great panel of folks. We're going to talk about the theologies of this conflict, the history of the conflict, what the role of the United States is, and how we can best be part of moving forward to a peaceful solution. If you would join me now in prayer before I hand it over to our host, Will Levis, we'll do that together. And dear God, thank you so much for the hope of the Advent season. We pray that we pray for the strength to carry that hope even as we examine the violence and the pain and the suffering around the world, but especially that our friends in Israel and Palestine endure on a daily basis. We pray that you show us, open our eyes to the ways that make for peace. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
And Will Levis with Mennonite Mission Network is our host tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Will.
Well, thanks, Jason, and I definitely appreciate you inviting me to take part in what I know and trust will be a great and enlightening discussion. I'm sure we've been having a little technical difficulties, but I'm sure we'll be able to press our way through. And again, having a discussion that will be enlightening and hopefully for the viewers, get them an understanding of the Israel-Palestine situation that perhaps they haven't heard and understood before. So the way it will work is that we're going to open with some introductions. As you mentioned, that John Lapp, or we hope will be joining us soon, and also Stanley Green, Executive Director of Mennonite Mission Network, hopes to join the discussion. He's traveling and offers his apologies in advance because he was unfortunately had a scheduling conflict. But what we'll do is have each of the panelists sort of talk briefly to introduce what their emphasis will be, and then we'll come back and actually go into the discussion and get some questions out there, and then hopefully even get some questions from the viewers as well. So without any further ado, our panelists will be, as you mentioned, John Lapp, Director of Asia and Middle East for Mennonite Mission Network. And John relates to Mission Workers International Partners, and he will be emphasizing the history of the conflict. J. Darrell Byler is the Executive Director at Eastern Mennonite University Center for Justice and Peace Building. He's going to emphasize the theologies of the conflict. And then Rachelle Lindacher Slayball is Director of Mennonite Central Committee's U.S. Washington office, and she's going to emphasize the role of the United States. So I'd like to start and hand it over to Darrell, and then Rachelle, you can, as Darrell wraps up, you can follow suit and come right behind him. So Darrell, take it away.
Thanks, Will. So one of my favorite places to visit in Jerusalem is on the Mount of Olives, and it's a small chapel over the site of where Jesus is thought to have wept over Jerusalem. And I'm almost certain that Jesus would weep today about the misguided theology that has contributed to the current conflict in Israel-Palestine. And I would argue that neither the history of anti-Jewish theology or the more recent Christian Zionist theology contain a hint of good news. From the earliest centuries, if you look at the Christian theology, prominent church leaders espoused an anti-Jewish theology that suggested that the Jews should be marginalized and live in misery because they had rejected Jesus. That theology led for centuries to persecution of Jews. They had their property confiscated. They were forcibly baptized. They were sometimes had their children taken and educated in Christian institutions against the will of the parents. Their synagogues were burned, sometimes with Jews inside. And this theology is also responsible for the deafening silence of the Christian community during the Holocaust when Hitler killed 6 million Jews. So it's not hard to imagine why many Jews concluded that the only way for them to be safe was to have their own state. And indeed, that's what happened in 1948. But of course, the creation of the State of Israel had severe consequences for Palestinians, and Palestinians had 500 of their villages taken and destroyed, creating more than 700,000 refugees. If you fast forward then to the 20th century, there was a development of a very different theology, theology known as Christian Zionism. And according to this theology, some Christians see the return of Jews to the Holy Land as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and the idea that this state of Israel is God's chosen, and if you say anything critical of this state of Israel, that you are going against God's will. And so, meanwhile, Palestinians, including Palestinian Christians, point out that the policies and practices of this government that Christians from other parts of the world are so afraid of criticizing, this government is causing enormous suffering for the Palestinian people. There are Israeli settlements that are taking large swaths of Palestinian land. There's a separation barrier that impedes access to the farmland and to jobs and medical care. The Palestinians are humiliated daily at checkpoints. There are 5 million Palestinian refugees. And Palestinian Christian leaders have given a very blunt critique of Christian Zionist theology. They wrote in a document several years ago that any theology that legitimizes the occupation is far from Christian teachings, because true Christian theology is a theology of love and solidarity with the oppressed, a call to justice and equality among peoples. So the challenge for us, I think, as Christians is, can we imagine a theology that could be good news for both Jews and Palestinians? And I'd like to talk about that later on.
Rachel?
Yes, thanks so much for the invitation to join you this evening. As we think about the role of the United States government with regards to Palestine and Israel, it's clear that in many ways the United States has functioned as Israel's attorney, to borrow a phrase from Aaron David Miller, who has been a longtime U.S. negotiator between Israelis and Palestinians. And to realize why this is the case, it's important to look at the history of the relationship and what has gotten us to this point. And it's helpful to look at some specific ways in which the United States has backed Israel, often at great cost to Palestinians. And that includes diplomatic support, as well as how the U.S. has functioned throughout various peace processes over the years. And of course, the $3.2 billion each year that the U.S. gives Israel in military assistance, which makes Israel the largest recipient of U.S. foreign assistance. And I also hope to speak tonight to why it's critically important that we as U.S. citizens take time to contact our members of Congress about these policies. And I want to connect you to some resources to help you do just that.
Looks like John has been able to join us. How you doing, John Lab?
Very good. Thank
John,
you.
are you able to? Great. I was just checking to see if you're able to hear us fine. If you could give us some background regarding the history of the conflict quickly.
Okay, I'll try to do that quickly. Many people are under the impression that the conflict in the Middle East now goes back many generations, many centuries. Actually, under the Ottoman Empire from the early 1500s to early 1900s, there was relative peace and a goodwill between people living in the Holy Land. Christians, Muslims, Jewish people lived side by side. In the early part of the 20th century, though, things began to change. There was a rise of certain nationalisms. One of those was Zionism. Jewish people in Eastern Europe and Russia began to feel that they were suffering greatly because of pogroms and other ways that those communities were oppressing them. Jewish people began to want to emigrate to other places, including the U.S., but also their ancient ancestral homeland in what they call the land of Israel, or Palestine. Also, Arab nationalisms began about the same time, rising up against the Ottoman Empire rule that had been there for so many centuries. Right after World War II, the new United Nations determined that with the immigration to Palestine of many Jewish people, it made sense to try to set up new homelands for the Jewish people and for what it called the indigenous people, the Arab Palestinians. It did that by setting up what it called a UN partition plan in September of 1947. The partition plan divided up the land between a new Jewish state and a Arab state. The Jewish people at that time made up about 33% of the total population west of the Jordan River, but the land that they were allotted for the new Jewish state was well over 50%. Not surprisingly, the Arabs resisted that and began fighting almost immediately. There were a lot of skirmishes between Jews and Arabs in the 1940s, but it came to a head in 1948 when the future Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, proclaimed the establishment of a Jewish state in May 1948, and almost immediately a major war developed between the Palestinians, but more importantly at that point between the armies of the surrounding Arab states, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. All of those armies came to fight against this new Jewish state. And the outcome of that war, as we know, was the establishment of the Jewish state, but also these Arab armies took over pieces of the land that they incorporated later into those states. So Syria took over the Golan Heights, and it became part of Syria. Jordan took over the West Bank, and it became part of Jordan. And Egypt took over the Gaza Strip, and it became part of Egypt. There was an armistice then in early 1949 between those states and Israel, but that didn't bring a peace. It was just establishing sort of lines of demarcation between the two sides. And there were refugees then that were left in this mix. Over 700,000 Palestinian refugees fled to Lebanon, to Jordan, and to Gaza as part of Egypt. And over 850,000 Jews from different parts of the Arab world eventually left their ancient homes, and some moved to the west and some moved to the new state of Israel. And of course, there were remaining Arabs still within the state of Israel that eventually attained Israeli citizenship. And then finally, in 1967, Israel, in response to a lot of skirmishes around the borders with Palestinians and even with the armies of those same Arab countries, Israel led a preemptive strike to try to stem that violence. And they ended up really hitting very hard against the Arab armies and taking over those pieces that we know now as the occupied territories, including the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, but also the Sinai Peninsula, which had been held by Egypt before that. I think I'll stop with that older history at this point, and maybe we can come back to some later events as we talk.
Great, John. And in fact, I did want to come back to you in just a second and talk about some historical markers since 1967. But Darrell, I wanted you to address something, as John said, regarding Zionism and the impact of Zionism, and actually talk a little bit about how the religious leaders felt about that, and that how Zionism was actually a more secular movement.
Well, it does have a secular component. I'd like to talk more about the Christian Zionism because that's the part that I think the church is responsible for. And the main components of Christian Zionism are that this idea that John talked about Jews coming back to Palestine, that the return of the Jews to the Holy Land is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So this idea of the creation of the state of Israel in 1948 is fulfillment of prophecy. Another component is that now, instead of the Jews being subhuman, as they were kind of thought of as part of the anti-Jewish theology, now they are considered to be the apple of God's eye and have special favor with God. The Holy Land, the Promised Land, is thought to still belong to the Jews, and bringing them back to this Holy Land is a prerequisite to the second coming of Jesus. So there are Christians in the U.S., for example, that send money to help resettle Jewish people in the West Bank because they see this as helping to promote the second coming. And then probably the most challenging part of this theology is that God will bless nations who bless this modern Jewish state, and God will curse those who curse it. And for that reason, many Christians are very timid about saying anything at all critical about Israeli government policies, even if they are quite harmful to the Palestinian people. And that's the part of this that I think our Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters find most difficult to understand, why we aren't concerned about their plight.
Excellent. Rachel, I wanted to come to you to talk about some U.S. role in terms of historical markers, but I'd like you to comment after that. John can talk to us about some of the historical markers that are important since 1967. John.
Well, as you know, when Israel took over the West Bank and Gaza Strip, one of the things that happened in the aftermath of that was that civilians began to move in from Israel into those regions, Jewish civilians. That's what we call the settlements now. It started out relatively slowly in the 1970s. Most of the settlements were either suburbs in Jerusalem, which would have been largely secular people, or sort of radical right-wing Jewish groups known as Gush Emunim, which went into outpost areas and tried to stake out claims for Jews to settle in the ancient highlands of what they called Judea and Samaria, but also in Gaza. The settlements have always been a thorn in the flesh for Palestinians because, to a large extent, they were taking away Palestinian lands, which Palestinians had farmed or had even lived on. But Israel has always been impervious to these criticisms, including criticisms from the international community. The settlements have expanded at different rates under different governments, but always fairly steadily under all governments. Just to give a couple of numbers, in 1983, all the settlers including in Jerusalem and West Bank and other occupied territories, was 106,000. In 1993, it had risen to 281,000. In 2004, 441,000. And in 2014, 750,000. So you see that it's almost been doubling every 10 years. And this has been very difficult for Palestinians to stomach. That's one point to make. Another point to make is just to remember the development of Palestinian political process. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which our younger viewers may not even remember, was established in 1964, and it was quickly accepted as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people from the late 1960s onward. However, it fairly early on began pretty vigorous armed resistance, not only against military, the Israeli military, but also against Israeli civilians, and eventually against civilians of other countries as well. So attacks at the Munich Olympics in the 1970s and hijackings of airliners over the years more or less cemented the PLO as having a reputation as an international terrorist organization. Palestinians resisted that international reputation, Palestinians in the occupied territories, but they still saw that was their only government, and so they looked to it for leadership, though it was in exile. But in 1987, Palestinians within the occupied territories suddenly began to rise up and what they called shaking off. That's one of the meanings of the word intifada. Shaking off this oppression that they felt from the Israelis for those 20 years since 1967. This intifada began with demonstrations and stone throwing, but also it had components of alternative grassroots humanity building activities, such as jointly working on kitchen gardens, beginning cross-border dialogue between Jews and Palestinians, rehabilitation of injured people, etc. As time went on, these actions, however nonviolent they were responded to by the Israeli military with rubber bullets and even live ammunition. And so the Palestinian reaction also became more violent. But many positive egalitarian relationships were established between peace activists, Palestinians, and Israelis. And that kind of initiative led eventually in the 1990s to the peace talks that eventually led to the establishment of a Palestinian Authority, a kind of a quasi-government in the West Bank and Gaza. And that authority continues today, though Palestinians in many ways have begun to despair that that authority is just a puppet of the continuing Israeli control over the lives of people and even the government institutions in the occupied territories. Should also mention that Hamas was started just about the same time as the Intifada in 1987, and Hamas has now actually taken governmental control of Gaza. Hamas, of course, is a religious Muslim organization which also seeks to liberate the land of Palestine from Israeli occupation. But it has sort of almost taken on the role of the violent opponent for Israel, and Israel, as we know, responds very vigorously even to the rocket attacks that Hamas fighters have launched against southern Israel from the Gaza Strip. So Israel still feels threatened, and they still don't feel like they can live peacefully with their Palestinian neighbors even today.
Rachel, what role has the United States played in some of these significant events that John mentions, or just historically?
Sure. Well, I'll go back to 1917, which is the year of the Balfour Declaration from Britain, and the U.S. Decided to support that declaration. It declared that there should be a national home for the Jewish people in the area of Palestine. Now, of course, the U.S. has long tried to balance various interests in the Middle East, including wanting to have good relations with the oil-rich countries such as Saudi Arabia. And in fact, in 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt agreed to consult with both Arabs and Jews before any kinds of decisions would be made by the U.S. Regarding the area of Palestine. But his successor, President Truman, was much more focused on the domestic political calculations, which he felt favored support for a Jewish or Israeli state. And thus, despite the concerns of some of the U.S. diplomatic and military officials, in 1948, when the State of Israel was declared, the U.S. did give immediate recognition to the state. And for the most part, from that point on, the U.S. government has continued to provide very strong support for Israel. And in fact, you hear terms such as unbreakable bond or strongest ally being used to describe the relationship between the two countries.
What does that support look like? Can you describe it? What is it, and what does it mean?
Sure. Well, at various points over the years, the U.S. has served in the role of mediator or broker for so-called peace processes. And in these processes, the U.S. has raised some issues of great concern to Palestinians, so issues like the right of return for Palestinian refugees, the use of land and water resources, the settlements, the illegal Israeli settlements that John was mentioning. Those kinds of issues have been raised by the U.S., but it's been clear that there's never been an equal balance of power in these negotiations. And as I mentioned earlier, in many ways, the U.S. has functioned as Israel's lawyer in some of these talks, rather than really being an honest broker. There are also other ways in which the U.S. government has provided strong support to Israel. One of those ways is by regularly vetoing resolutions at the United Nations Security Council that the U.S. sees as in some ways being critical of Israeli policies. Over the past several decades, there have been more than 40 of those resolutions that the U.S. has vetoed. And finally, as I mentioned before, Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. military aid, about $3.2 billion each year. So if you total up the assistance that's been given since 1949, it tops at least $120 billion. And the U.S. does give significant assistance to Palestinians as well, but on a smaller scale and with far more strings attached. Each year, the U.S. gives about $600 million to Palestinians, if you count up the funds that are distributed through the U.S. Agency for International Development, as well as assistance to the Palestinian Authority and to some UN agencies.
Why does the U.S. give such strong support? And why is there a difference in the level of support that's given?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It's one that many people wonder is why does the U.S. support Israel so strongly? I would say that there have been several reasons for the original U.S. support for the State of Israel that have continued for the most part in the years since. The first point, I think, is that I think there is a sincere desire on the part of many U.S. policymakers to respond to the horrors of the Holocaust, to provide a safe homeland for the Jewish people as they see it. Secondly, I think domestic political considerations have been very important. In other words, a lot of members of Congress believe that strong support for Israel is what is popular with U.S. voters, and that dynamic has only been strengthened with the establishment of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, its acronym, which is a group that has helped to channel significant funds to the campaigns of members of Congress over the years. And finally, there really isn't a strong counterweight to some of these domestic considerations. Internationally, while some Arab nations have raised concerns about the Palestinians over the years, they have a lot of economic and other ties with the U.S., which are very important to them, and in many cases too important to risk severing over this particular issue. And here domestically within the United States, grassroots efforts to call for a shift in U.S. policy towards Palestine and Israel simply have not been nearly as well funded or as well organized as groups like AIPAC.
Darrell, share how theology has impacted some of these decisions that have been made over the years, some of the significant moments. How has theology impacted?
Well, just following up on what Rochelle was just talking about, she mentioned the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. Mm-hmm. There is a Christian organization in the U.S. called Christians United for Israel that also has significant clout in Washington, and they take lots of groups to Israel for tours. And again, their motivation is this Christian Zionist theology that bringing Jews back to Palestine is a part of fulfilling biblical prophecy and preparing for the return of Jesus. So that's been a very powerful motivator for their political advocacy in Washington, and also for providing financial resources for Jews to resettle. So it has a very direct connection in helping the settlement movement in the West Bank, but also providing political cover to members of Congress for continuing to support the state of Israel, even when these what many would call violations of international law of settling your own population on occupied territories, and this unwillingness again of Christians in the U.S., many Christians, not all certainly, to be critical of these policies that in other situations we would call human rights violations.
John, what can you tell us about some of the issues or history of the conflict that Westerners tend to ignore or never hear about?
Well, I think that the main thing isn't so much a general thing that we ignore, but a refusal to understand that what we're talking about here are very divergent views of every event that has come along. It's striking the different language that Palestinians and Israelis use for different events or situations. The Palestinians are convinced that the British favored Jewish immigration. The Jews generally are convinced that the British refused to allow Jewish immigration during the British Mandate period. The Israelis are proud to talk about their war of independence, whereas the Palestinians talk about the Nakba, that means the catastrophe that they underwent in 1948.
Mm-hmm.
The surrounding Arab armies for Israel, they invaded its space, and for Palestinians, those surrounding Arab armies intervened to support them in what they needed to do to establish a foothold. So things like this really speak to why the whole situation has become so difficult to solve, because people really are looking at the same incidents in very opposite points of view. And for us to understand those points of view is difficult because we're looking at it from the outside. We may think that we're looking neutrally, but in many cases we are listening to one or the other side, and it's difficult for us also to understand the point of view of the people that we don't talk to first.
Darrell, in that context, does the Christian Zionist theology leave any room for embracing the Palestinians or them having a place at all? What is the perspective there?
I think there's some hope on that score. Well, there's an organization called Bethlehem Bible College that has been hosting conferences every other year. They call them Christ at the Checkpoint. And they are working specifically at targeting evangelical Christians from the West to come and see what the reality of life is like for Palestinian Christians. And I think that's beginning to stretch the theology of Christian Zionism to make more space for Palestinians. I think overall, if you try to think about a theology that could be good news for both Jews and Palestinians, it's important to think about the trajectory of Scripture seems to be one of extending the table. The idea that God's love is for the whole world and that God is not a tribal God, but that God loves people from all nations, and that we need to think in that kind of a framework if we want to have a theology that is potentially good news for Jews and Palestinians. And Paul was reaching for this when he talked about no longer Jew nor Greek, the idea that we are one in Christ. And I think that's where Christians should be placing their energy.
Rachel, is the U.S. Policy in any ways has left room where something like that can happen, where it is not so strongly Israel that there's no room for Palestinians?
Well, that's a good question. I think in order for there to be significant changes in U.S. policy on this issue, members of Congress in particular are going to have to hear a different voice from their voters. At this point in time, I think many members of Congress perceive evangelical Christians in particular as having exactly the perspective that Daryl has described from a Christian Zionist point of view. Many times when I meet with members of congressional staffs, they're somewhat surprised to have church organizations come and talk about this conflict in the way that I do and my ecumenical colleagues who are with me. But I do think that it's possible. I think that it's certainly in Israelis' long-term interest to find a much more sustainable and peaceful solution to this than the current status quo. I also think it's very much in U.S. long-term interest to help that to happen. So it would be, from my perspective, very much in the interests of Palestinians, Israelis, and the U.S. to work towards a just and sustainable solution.
What do you see as the stumbling block? Because I think a lot of people, as they see it played out in the news media, they just see, constant conflict and an inability of people to see kind of eye to eye, to see it from their own individual perspectives, like what John was saying about how people see these different conflicts. What is the stumbling block? How do you see the U.S. leading, or how do you see us getting past that?
Well, as John pointed out, certainly the first voices that you talk to do shape very much how you understand this particular conflict. And for example, the group that I mentioned earlier, AIPAC, does a very effective job of taking members of Congress in their first term in Congress to Israel and being sure that they hear very much from Israeli policymakers their side of the story. One thing that we encourage when we meet with congressional offices is for members of Congress to meet with a much broader perspective of Israelis and Palestinians, many of whom are doing very good work nonviolently and documenting human rights violations and that kind of thing. And so from our perspective, one thing that will be important is for U.S. policymakers to have that broader perspective, to hear more sides of the story and to realize some of the complexities of this issue rather than simply one side of the story.
Jason, we're going to come to you at this time with some questions from viewers.
Right, and this isn't directed to a particular panelist, so whoever wants to tackle these, feel free. But the first question was, what's the status of the two-state solution that seemed to be floated as the most probable pathway to peace in the past number of years, but it doesn't seem to be on the table as much. I wonder if anyone can give us some background and get us up to date on where we stand with that.
Rochelle should probably speak to that, but I'm happy to.
Sure, I can give it a try. It's certainly still very much U.S. policy to support a two-state solution to the conflict. I don't see that particular stance changing anytime soon. The negotiations that Secretary Kerry was leading were certainly along the lines of trying to get to the point of a two-state solution. But it is absolutely true that it's hard to see that happening in the current reality. The settlements that we've been talking about are throughout the West Bank, dividing it up in a sense like Swiss cheese. It's hard to imagine what a viable and contiguous state there would look like. And of course, Gaza is subject to significant blockade at this point as well. And so it's hard to see exactly, and without pretty dramatic changes, how a two-state solution could come about, but it's still certainly one of the options on the table. Others talk about a one-state solution. In some senses, we currently have a de facto one-state solution. with the occupied territories, but there could also be the possibility, perhaps down the road, of one state that would be democratic, that guarantees equal rights for all residents, whether they be Israeli or Palestinian. And so some advocates work for that as well.
Do you have things to add to that, Daryl?
No, I thought Rochelle covered that very well. It's just very difficult to imagine a two-state solution with the breadth of the settlement movement. John talked about over 800,000 Israelis now settled on Palestinian land, and it's just hard to figure out how that could work.
Another question we had from the audience was just wondering about some stories of hope. Are there stories or situations of different groups on Israelis and Palestinians working together for peace? Do we see those seeds of hope there? And happy to have anyone address this. John, I don't know, in your experience there, do you have any good stories of seeing people working together and working for peace?
Well, there's a lot of stories, as I mentioned, from the early Intifada days and the late 80s and early 90s. Part of the problem of human contact stories like that, though, is that is so much more difficult now with the way the Israelis have constructed walls and fences between people, so that not only are Palestinians cut off from each other in many ways, but Palestinians and Israelis have very little opportunity legally to get together and talk about their lives, share stories, and come to know each other. There are some organizations that take Palestinians and Israelis out to third countries where they can do that, but that, of course, can only be for a very small slice of either population. It's not nearly as viable to bring people together now as it was 20 years ago.
I'd like to share a story. One of the recent graduates from our Center for Justice and Peace Building is a Palestinian, from a Palestinian Christian family. His name is Bashara. And in May of this year, his family had the unfortunate experience of having 1,500 of their trees destroyed in Bethlehem by the Israeli military. A few months ago, Bashar, who's now living in Washington, D.C., is working on starting a Nakba museum to tell the story of the Palestinian catastrophe that John talked about earlier. And a Jewish student at Georgetown University called Bashar and said, "I heard what happened to your family's trees. I'm very sorry about this tragedy, and is there something I can do to help?" And so the two of them together, and Bashar shared the story with this Jewish student that he's trying to create a Nakba museum. And this Jewish student said, "Well, is there something I can do to help?" And Bashar said, "I need a website." And the Jewish student said, "That's what I do." And so he designed a beautiful website. If you look at the Nakba Project, if you Google that, Nakba Project, Memory and Hope. And Bashar's idea is that the hope for this conflict is in our memory. And going back to the period that John talked about at the beginning, where Jews and Palestinians shared this land in peace. And that it is that memory that gives us hope that this could happen again. And I find a lot of hope in seeing a Jewish student and a Palestinian student saying, we can tell each other stories of suffering, we can learn each other's stories, we can move forward together.
I think many of our other questions had to do with, well, so what do we do? And what's the response for Mennonite Church USA and folks here in the United States? And I think we're going to cover that a little bit later, so I'll toss it back to you, Will.
Yeah, actually, I think we're at the point of the webinar to talk about, where do we go from here? And the question I'd like to throw out to all of you to talk about is how can Western Christians, especially Mennonites, make a difference in the problem, and especially in the context of so different two very different narratives. What can Western Christians and Mennonites in particular do? John, you can start.
Unique possibilities in this regard. We have long had partnerships in the Middle East on both sides of the Green Line, the line dividing Palestine and Israel. So we know Jews, we know Palestinians, and we can learn from both of them. One of the challenges about listening to one or the other side first is that we can often get labeled as being pulled toward one side or the other. But if we are careful to listen to both sides and to talk creatively and challengingly to both sides after we well understand them, I think we can be helpful to both sides as they begin to work together with each other in different ways. So we've been involved in partnership. We also have a lot of experience in peace building, and peace building is what we do as an outgrowth of our commitment to the gospel of love. So I think that these three things: partnership, peace building, and maintaining a commitment to the gospel of love, are ways that we can be helpful to both Palestinians and Israelis.
Rachel?
Sure. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about why it matters that U.S. citizens contact Congress. As I mentioned, I meet regularly with congressional offices on this topic, and I've actually had staffers tell me that they recognize what's going on, that the U.S. could play a much more constructive role in the Middle East. But they have told me specifically, until they hear from people within their own district and state asking them to take that stance and to shift their position, they will not do so. The way that they're currently voting is based on what they think people in their state and district want them to do. And so it's really vitally important that people of faith, and we as Mennonites in particular, take the time to contact members of Congress about this issue. Our office here in Washington tries to make that very easy for you. We send out action alerts roughly once a month on this topic that include sample letters that you can personalize and then just click send and it'll send it off to your members of Congress. So if you go to washington.mcc.org and click on the button there that says sign up for action alerts, you can get signed up to receive those regularly. Mennonite Central Committee does work in Palestine and in Israel and would welcome your donations for our work there as well. And then finally, I also wanted to mention the Mennonite Palestine Israel Network, which is shortened to MENOPIN. This is a grassroots network within Mennonite Church USA working for peace with justice in Palestine and Israel. We're working to promote educational resources within congregations as well as action and advocacy kinds of things. And to get involved with the Mennonite Palestine Israel Network, all you have to do is send an email to menopin@gmail.com. So that's MENNOPIN@gmail.com. So I would encourage you to consider getting involved in both of those ways.
Great. So far we've heard from John talking about the emphasis on partnerships, peace building, and being strongly committed to the gospel of love as you're talking to both sides. And Rochelle, you talked about the emphasis of individuals contacting their Congress members because we've seen the state of Washington, D.C., and that Congressmen very much act based on what the people in their district are telling them to do and how they're voting. So the more you can meet with them, the more that you can get them to move in your direction. And then you mentioned also contacting MENOPIN, the grassroots network working for peace and justice at MENOPIN, MENNOPIN @gmail.com. Darrell, what can you add to this in regards to what people can do, particularly Mennonites, do now as we go forward from here?
Well, I would agree with the notion that it's important to learn the stories of both Palestinians and Israeli Jews. I think there's a lot of work to do in repairing this centuries-long history of anti-Jewish theology, and it's important for Jewish people to know that Mennonites and other Christians see them as equal partners, as people worthy of trust and friendship. It's also important to hear the stories of Palestinian suffering, and that 500 villages have been destroyed and their land has been taken, and how they feel about Christian Zionist theology that kind of overlooks their suffering because of this sense that Jews are now somehow superhuman. So I think hearing both of those stories is important. I think also related to one of the things John talked about, the importance of being voices that help each other to look at ways that this land can be shared and that the interests of both people can be served. For Israelis, reminding that security will not ultimately come through occupation and oppressing another people. And for those elements of the Palestinian society, that small element that resorts to violence, that justice will not be found through acts of violence. I really like what Reverend Mitri Rahab, who's the Palestinian pastor of the Lutheran Church in Bethlehem, talks about, that this land happens to be the homeland of two peoples, and that peace and blessing on the land and on the two peoples will depend on sharing it, and only then will the biblical promises be fulfilled. So this vision of how can we find a way of sharing this land, hearing each other's stories of pain, and finding a future, again, going back to a shared land.
Any final thoughts on maybe that you weren't able to share? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'd like to mention a few other opportunities, things that are already going on, and some other opportunities that our churches can take advantage of to engage in this issue on a deeper level. Well, one initiative that we're really happy to see is the Come and See Fund, and that was in response to Kairos Palestine, a 2009 appeal by Palestinian Christians, otherwise known as the Kairos Document, for Christians in the West to come and see the state of living under occupation. In response to that, Mennonite Church USA, Mennonite Mission Network, Everence, Mennonite Central Committee, Peace and Justice Support Network are working together to send 100 Mennonite pastors and other leaders on Israel-Palestine learning tours over the next 5 years. And in fact, we've already sent 30 folks there. So these folks go and can experience it and then come back to their home communities and relay those experiences. Two other practical things that churches can do to become more engaged. One is the Peace and Justice Support Network has a worship service called Pray for the Peace of Jerusalem. And it's a great way to engage this on a congregational level, to be thinking about these deeper issues. This was written by Tom Harder, a pastor of Lorraine Avenue Mennonite Church in Kansas, and it's great material. Another thing that we recommend is to study the Kairos document. That call from Palestinian Christians is a rich document. Studying that in a small group format or Sunday school format can be very helpful, as well as when you try to wrestle with these complex issues. Thank you, Will.
Well, great. Well, I thank you all for your participation in this. I think it was a great discussion, and appreciate you all allowing me to take part in it. And I hope the viewers and those who see this have gotten some greater enlightenment and understanding of the issue. So, Jason, I'll put it back to you, and you can wrap us out. Thanks again.
I want to say thanks for joining us. Thank you to the panel here, to John, Rochelle, Daryl, Will. And until we see you again, you can go to pjsn.org for those resources. You can also replay this webinar back. So if you know folks who weren't able to attend tonight, check out pjsn.org in the coming days, and this will be up so they can watch it at another time. Thank you, and we will see you again soon.